We are studying 1 Samuel together, and we're doing it one verse at a time. And so today we find ourselves in chapter 17. We're looking at the first 11 verses of one of the best-known stories in the entire Bible. While you're turning to 1 Samuel 17, we are wrapping up our quarterly focus on evangelism, which gives way next week to a quarterly focus on missions. Very similar, but crossing cultural boundaries. Maybe one final encouragement for you when we think about evangelism. For some of you, evangelism is an exciting task, and you may be gifted in evangelism or just driven to see the lost brought to a knowledge of the truth, perhaps even by accidents of personality. You enjoy having those conversations. And then there are others who are terrified by evangelism, and there's a whole spectrum of people in between. So maybe let me just give you one encouragement. You know that no matter what your personality may be, all of us jointly have been entrusted with the task of bringing the gospel to others. Wherever you fall on that spectrum, let me encourage you, at the very least, to commit to pray every day for perhaps a month, that God would give you opportunities to share the gospel. Let's just start there. That's not so scary. What I've found in my own experience is when I do that for any period of time, I immediately have opportunities to share the gospel. So I would encourage you, if evangelism is something that you are hesitant about, at least begin by praying for those opportunities and just see what God will do. All good stories have a chapter in them that we might call a chapter of despair. It's the part of the story where there is no way forward. The enemies are entirely around the city. They are battering against the gate, and the forces within the city are much too small to repel them. The man has just lost his last opportunity with his love interest, and she is on her way to the airport to fly away forever. Friendship is over. The team is losing or has lost. The world seems unsavable. And notice that I said, you have this chapter of despair in all the good stories. Good stories. But see, none of those things seem good. It's a chapter of despair. But I would say to you that the stories you consider good, if they didn't have that chapter, you wouldn't consider them good. We love the stories that have a chapter of despair in them. Because when you're reading a book that has that kind of a story, you know that in your right hand here, you still have a chunk of pages. That's time for the chapter of despair to resolve itself into the final chapter. You know things are going to work themselves out. And that's what we love, the working out of the issues. And that gives you a real confidence. That's why you like those stories. Here's the issue, though. When you're actually living out your life story, you don't get to hold the chunk of pages in your right hand. Maybe this morning you've come in here in the chapter of despair. And there are trials so significant in your life right now that you cannot, by any act of your imagination, come up with a way that things can turn out well. You don't know how many pages are left, so the temptation is then to think, maybe this chapter of despair is really the last chapter of your book. Everyone living through their story comes to that place and feels that way. That's part of the despair. There's no sense of a future. There's no sense of a hope. The enemy's at the gate. You do not know how the enemy could be repelled. Life does not usually turn out as neatly as the books do either. Things are typically much more confusing. When the Burmese missionary Adoniram Judson was in a cruel prison and had his feet suspended above his head while he slept so that the mosquitoes could feast upon them, and when Adoniram Judson in that moment was not thinking about ways he could be released, but was only thinking he was hoping for an easy death without torture, that was a chapter of despair. But see, you know how the rest of that story turns out, or if you don't, you can go read it. That was not the last chapter of his story. The challenge is in your life, you don't know if it's the last chapter. You don't know if things work themselves out, except, brothers and sisters, you do. You do. No matter the depth of the despair in this chapter you are in right now, by faith, I ask you to do the impossible thing. It's impossible almost when you're despairing, but by faith it can be done. To know that all the good stories, every single one of them, has a chapter like the one you're going through. Yeah, but it's different when you're seated in a comfortable chair with the pages still in your right hand. That's true. But don't you know that all the good stories have despair in them? And it is the chapter of despair that makes the resolution at the end of the story so meaningful, so powerful, and so good. Is it possible? Is it even within the realm of possibility that the same could prove true in your specific case? Well, if you don't think it's possible, you're going to have a problem with the Bible. The very center of all our belief is a rabbi who had 12 close friends, and they had to watch him be taken away by guards. They fled. He was beaten, unjustly tried, and under the jealousies of the leadership of his own people, handed over to the enemy and hung up on a cross to die a very slow and agonizing death, which he died. No rescue, no escape. He died that death. His mother watched him. A thick darkness hung in the air. That is a chapter of despair. And Christianity does not deny chapters of despair. It just says we preach the cross and the resurrection. There are more pages in our right hand. The chapter of despair gives way for the Christian always. It's the heart of what we believe. It gives way to the final chapter. It is not the final chapter. It gives way to the final chapter. It prepares for the final chapter. It makes the final chapter a beautiful and a wonderful thing. Now, it is an interesting thing because if you stood before the cross, of course, we know the story, so it's easy now, but if you actually stood before the cross and you were not accustomed in your life to seeing dead people not be dead anymore, there you stood and you watch him breathe his final breath, and someone were to tell you, this isn't the end, you would say, not the end. He's dead. What? Is he going to come back alive? Well, yes, he is. Can you look at your situation with all the death in it and see that it is making way for a different chapter at the end? It's not easy to do. Sometimes it's almost impossible to do. But I think it's because of how difficult that is that the Holy Spirit has inspired for us our text today. We are beginning one of the most popular stories in the Bible. The danger is we will skim over it because you already know it. It is David and Goliath. But we are going to work our way at a good pace, but slowly through the passage. Today, in the first 11 verses, David doesn't even show up. We are merely having the setting put in front of us. We are being shown, we are lingering long over a situation that was horrible and impossible. Truly a chapter of despair in Israel's history where it looked like there was no way forward. And what I want you to do is put yourself in the position of those who experience this. Not us who have the end of the story, we'll get to that. But I mean put yourself in the position of those who encountered this giant. Let's look in 1 Samuel 17. We're starting in the first verse. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, or on a slope on the other side of the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we'll be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. The point of these verses is how unlikely it was that anyone would defeat this Philistine, and how unlikely it was that Israel would come away from this battle victorious. 0.0001%, near impossibility for it to happen. In fact, that's the way it's understood by those who experienced it in verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Realistically here, they cannot win. Goliath cannot be beaten, realistically. Saul, after all, was the tallest man in Israel. And he was not near as tall as this giant, and had not half the courage this giant had. Hence, he was not in the valley fighting the battle. This is a mountain plated in metal. So this, therefore, is a chapter of despair. But what I want to show you is that this chapter of despair, just like the ones that you experience in your life, it is not accidental to the story. It's not something that you could remove from the story and still have the same effect in the ending. This chapter is completely necessary. It is a pivotal part of the story being what it is. You don't this day have a great fond recollection, nor we as a whole culture have a fond recollection of the story of David and the man he fought who was about his same size and stature that he ended up beating. You remember the story of David and Goliath because of Goliath, because there was no way he could be beaten, but he was. That's the point of this. 11 whole verses to linger over the impossibility of the situation. Because chapters of despair, not just this one, but the ones in your life, they are always God's way of setting a stage. They are God's way of getting your attention. Little things you notice in a little way, but the big things that threaten to unravel your whole life, you cannot help but notice with eyes wide open. And others notice them too. But that's the point. God loves to set the stage by putting massive impossibilities in front of his people, and then at the 11th hour, when all hope seems lost, coming in and quite easily fixing it all. To just flex, to just show you how powerful he is. So what we have here today is God setting the stage. I want to show you that. Of course, those who live the experience didn't see it that way, and we don't usually see it that way in our lives, but that is what's happening, and I want to demonstrate that in the text. We're going to look at the stage that God is setting for his own glory here. First by looking down, and then by looking up. So I want to, first in the text, as the text does, look down. I mean, look down at the topography. We're looking at the landscape, which is the stage for what God is about to do, and it appears in these first 3 verses. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. and encamped between Soko and Azekah and Ephes Damim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with a valley between them. First of all, none of us are surprised that the Philistines have come back for another round. The Philistines are the kind of archetypal enemy of God's people Israel. We have already seen them in the early part of this kingdom of Israel. We have seen lots of Philistines. The Philistines lived just westward of God's people. They lived by the Mediterranean Sea down on the coast. They had 5 major cities. Gath was one of them. That's where Goliath is from, and it's nearest to the battle that's happening here. You remember, as we've already seen in 1 Samuel, that many years before, when Israel gathered at Mizpah under Samuel for a kind of national revival, the Philistines showed up and came to attack, and God miraculously repelled the Philistines, drove them back to the coast, and Samuel set up a monument, an Ebenezer, to remember what God did in driving the Philistines away. And we read back then, quote, the Philistines were subdued. But years and years go by, the Philistines rebuild their strength, and then by the time that Saul becomes king, the Philistines are back in the land. Actually, when the Lord told Samuel that he was going to make Saul king, he told Samuel, quote, he shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines. And Saul did. In chapter 14, the Lord gave the Philistines into the hand of Saul, you remember, but Saul botched the operation by a rash vow. Said, nobody eats, the men grew weary, and his own son said of that fight, quote, the defeat among the Philistines has not been great. So we are not surprised that they're back. They chased them away to the coast, but did not destroy them. So they are back. They're not as far into the interior as they were in chapter 14, so that's good. Soko here is about 8 miles east of Gath. Gath is one of those major Philistine cities. So we're only 8 miles east. We're in the lowlands of Israel. You can see in our text it speaks of Soko, which belongs to Judah. So yes, they are back in the land that belongs to Israel, or Judah, the territory of Judah, not as far deep as they were previously. These other places mentioned, Azekah, Ephes Damim, are just areas close by to Soko where this is taking place. But there's a problem. They're not as far into the interior. The problem, however, is the valley of Elah. Topographically, the valley of Elah is a broad, open valley, but it stretches all the way from the coast, all the way from the land of Philistia, right in to the interior of Israel, right toward Bethlehem. So whoever controls the valley of Elah can make their way quite easily into the land. And so this is a pivotal battle that's taking place. So when you look down at just the area that's being fought over, this isn't one of those like take it or leave it type battles. This is pivotal for the future of Israel's safety. This is a battle that cannot be lost. This battle has to be won. The problem is it appears that it cannot be won. This is a high-stakes conflict. What is more, what's interesting here in terms of setting the stage is that this is not the first battle with the Philistines to take place across a gap. We saw this back in chapter 13, where you had the Philistines gather in mass in Michmash in the north, and Saul's people were down here in Geba in the south, and there was a depression between them in the land so they could see each other. And then in that depression, Jonathan went in, and there was a ravine that jutted down and back up. And that's what Jonathan used to go down and back up and strike the Philistines, and eventually they won the battle. So this is very much like what we saw in chapter 13, but there is one difference. We're not talking about a ravine. We're talking about a big, broad, open valley. The kind of valley that if people were to stand on both sides, everyone could see what was happening in it. Isn't that interesting? Almost like a stage is being set with the highest possible visibility for something to happen. We know the story. That's exactly what is happening here. Just the topography, just the location, the valley of Elah where this is taking place itself is demonstrating as we look down that this chapter of despair has a very distinct purpose. God is going to use it. It is a perfect stage. It is a chapter of despair. There is an armored giant involved. There is no way forward that anyone can see. But God likes it that way, you know? And he wants everyone to see it. He puts it out front. Chapters of despair are just stages God uses to get his glory because they grab everyone's attention and they make everyone look. So when God does remarkable things at the 11th hour in the impossible situation, everyone notices it in a way you might miss it if he did it otherwise. That is the point. All eyes are looking into the valley of Elah. So when we look down, you can see God is setting the stage. Now we need to look up. And you have to look up quite high, actually, at this giant. Just notice verse 4. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. A cubit was about 18 inches, and a span about half of that. So add them all together, and you have a giant who is 9 feet and 9 inches tall. And that might be difficult to visualize. I don't know if you have 10-foot ceilings in your home or you have been in a home with 10-foot ceilings. Okay, Goliath goes like this, and he's touching the top. So Goliath is huge. He is very tall. Now, Saul was a head taller of anyone in Israel. Goliath was several heads taller than Saul. He's a very tall, he was a giant. It's interesting, this probably means nothing, but it is interesting that it's the valley of Elah. Elah just means a terebinth tree or a kind of tree. I think Goliath was the tree in that valley. I mean, this guy was huge. You are looking up to see him. Now, the Old Testament, if you've read through it, you're aware that there are a number of giants that appear in the pages of the Old Testament. The very earliest ones are called the Nephilim in the first chapters of Genesis, when angels, apparently fallen angels or demons, somehow had intermarried with human women, and they gave birth to children, and they were called the Nephilim, the great men of old, and they were some kind of giants, and they appeared to have been partly responsible for the corruption of the earth leading to the flood. But if you read that in Genesis, it says they were on the earth then and also afterward, I think meaning after the flood. So somehow, even after the flood wipes them all out, in the future there are more Nephilim. These are the ones, actually, their descendants. There are a group of them called the sons of Anak. And when the Israelites first reach the promised land after the Exodus, and they send in the spies come back and say, we can't go in there. There are descendants of Nephilim in there, the sons of Anak. They are giants. We are like grasshoppers in our sight compared to them. And so they refuse to go in there because of the giants that are in the land. So again, giants. And then after they wander 40 years and finally return to the land before their actual conquest of Canaan, they fight Og, king of Bashan in the Transjordan area, and we are told that Og slept on a bed that was made of iron, and it was 9 cubits long, which is 13 and a half feet. So I don't know how tall he was within that bed, but he was giant. I just want to be clear as I start this discussion that we are not saying that being tall or being short is inherently right or wrong or anything like that. I do want to point out, though, the Old Testament, like we've seen, uses physical descriptions to teach us things, and pretty consistently in the Old Testament, giants are the bad guys all the way through. I don't really have a guess of why that'd be. Today, the tallest man we know who is alive is just over 8 feet, and that's completely fine as an issue with his pituitary gland. There's nothing moral about that, how tall or short you are. But there in the Old Testament, God liked to use the picture of these giants, probably in the way that later generations would develop their fables, always including these giants as the bad guys. Because it's scary. It helps to heighten the picture of the fear, and that's certainly what's happening here. So Goliath is a giant, truly a giant, almost 10 feet tall. It increases how intimidating, how frightening he is. This is before we have weapons that are projectile besides just slings and things like we're going to see. So a lot of hand-to-hand combat. So a giant is hard to fight. It's very hard to fight. If Goliath's height wasn't intimidating enough, now we're told about what he brings with him. His armor, his weapons. Look at this starting in verse 5. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. So we've looked up, and we're just working our way from the top down in the description here. And the first thing we notice is that he has a helmet of bronze, which is common in their armor at the time, is bronze. And it probably covers everything except just an opening in his face. Cover everything else. That's all you've got open. It's an opening in his face to see and to breathe. You work your way down and you come to his cuirass, come to what's covering his torso. And it's a kind of scale armor. We have these circles of metal that are put together on threads. That way you can move, but no weapons can penetrate. We're told here that this armor on his torso or on his chest is 5,000 shekels in weight. That is about 126 pounds. So just think about me, little less than me, okay? So think of someone carrying almost me on their chest. That's what his cuirass is. And then if you keep working your way down, you get to his greaves that are covering probably all of his legs, all the way down, covered again in bronze. Everything's covered in bronze. If you were to look at Goliath, the only thing not covered, the only vulnerable spot is a small opening by necessity on his face. But see, the problem is, if you're going to fight him, that's 10 feet up. Most people cannot reach the small opening. And on top of that, we're told in the text that his shield bearer went before him. This was not a shield bearer there just to hold extra equipment. This was a shield bearer with a large, probably rectangular shield that would literally go in front of him to block with the shield just for another layer of protection. There really was basically no way to beat Goliath. That's the point of all of this. You're fighting a mountain. First you have to climb the mountain, and see, the mountain's going to be fighting back. We see that when it describes his weaponry. He has that javelin on his back, which probably actually is more like a scimitar, some kind of a blade, some kind of a sword, which he would use if you got close enough, kill you. But if you weren't close enough, before you even get there, you can die, because he also has his spear that he's going to be throwing at you, and it says the shaft is like a weaver's beam, which is probably a description of size, meaning it's a big spear. We know that, of course, because it tells us about the tip of it, 600 shekels. That's about 15 pounds. You've been to the gym, you pick up that 15-pound dumbbell. That's just the iron tip. It's iron because iron's stronger than bronze. So when you throw that, it's going through your shield, through your armor, and you are dead. The point of this long description is just how impossible it would be for anyone to kill Goliath. He cannot be beaten. He cannot be scratched. He's the strongest man, the tallest man the Philistines have, in the best armor possible. He's basically untouchable. Now, you might think there's some other weakness. Is there some vulnerability? Is he afraid? Quite the opposite. He is thirsty for battle. You hear this in him starting in verse 8. He's not like Saul. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, good luck, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." He's offering here, understandably, I guess, a kind of representative combat. And you've maybe seen this in movies. It doesn't appear that this was common practice, certainly not in Israel in that day, maybe in Philistia. Maybe that's why he has to explain it to them. I have no idea. At any rate, nobody seems to have taken it that seriously, because after the battle, the Philistines lose and they just run away. So they do not keep their end of this agreement. But the fact that Israel accepted the challenge does suggest to us there was no other way to win this battle. There was no other way to defeat the Philistine force. This was all they. So if they were willing to send a champion in to fight Goliath, that suggests they were in a rather desperate situation. Now, what you can't miss in this is Goliath's appeal has such a boldness to it. In fact, we're going to see in future weeks, if you look down in verse 16, it says, "For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening." Verse 23 suggests that each of those days he used the same words. He was defying the ranks of Israel, the armies of Israel, day after day after day, down in the valley where everyone could see him and everyone could hear him. That is a real boldness on his part. And I suppose, too, that if you were 10 feet tall and armored like a tank, you would have a similar boldness. But he goes out there and makes that challenge every day. Verse 33, Saul is going to say, he has been a man of war from his youth. It's not his first rodeo. It's not his first battle. So when you come to the scene and you look down at the topography, it is a stage that is open for everyone to see. But when you look up, it just looks like everyone is going to witness the worst thing that's ever happened in Israel, a complete decimation of whoever their champion would be, followed by a pursuit of Israel into their land. How could it be anything else? Again, you have to sort of block out of your mind what we know of the story and just put yourself there. It couldn't be something else. That's all that was available. That was basically the only option. The only possibility, humanly speaking, was for someone to be obliterated by the armored mountain. Everyone, of course, in the line of Israel, and you too, if you were there, is thinking of possible solutions of what do we do? What could be the outcome? But who could come out with any solution? Who has an idea? Okay, you hoist me on your shoulders, I can almost reach his face. Like, who's going to have any solution to this impossible circumstance? Now, once you are convinced, like them, that there is no human solution, once every Israelite in the ranks is looking at the giant and is convinced there is nothing we can do, once every Philistine on the other side of the valley of Elah looks down and is convinced there is nothing they can do, once we reach that point of desperation, then God moves in. Not before. Not before that. It's right then. Then God says, okay, now the stage is really set. I just want to make sure that no one thinks there's any other way out of this than me. That's why in your life as a Christian, you know you've faced quite a number of 11th hour rescues. And see, those are rather uncomfortable. Midnight is the moment of doom, and now it is 10 p.m., and you're still waiting for the answer to your prayers. And if God doesn't answer in the next couple hours, it's all over. And you were praying all day, and you were thinking maybe 4 or 5 p.m., that will leave us a little buffer, a little breathing room. If God would just answer it then I could sleep well tonight. And there's no answer to prayer. And it's going on and on. You need money. You don't have money for groceries. You've got no money, but you need money by midnight. And so you're waiting at 3, 4, 5, 6 o'clock. You're praying. You're looking to God. No money. No prospect of money. You're not going to eat. Your family not going to. What are you going to do? And you're waiting, and it is getting to 11 o'clock, and you're still waiting. The reason for that, if you want to know, is that it takes a long time for Goliath to get his armor on. It takes a while for the stage to be set, for the great drama that God is planning to work out in your life. It doesn't happen right away. If God gave you the money at 4 p.m., you would say, thank you, God, and forget about it. God wants to get more glory than that. He wants you to see something more glorious than that. The chapter of despair in your life, it is not the last chapter, but it is a very necessary chapter. You need it. They had it. The cross of Jesus, that was a time of despair for the disciples. followed by the resurrection. The resurrection blew their minds because they lived through the chapter of despair and thought that's the last chapter. And God said, no, that's the first chapter. Now let me show you what I'm going to do. We don't simply say, as Christians, all have sinned. Your sin is too great, too grave. You cannot save yourself. There's no hope of it. Try as you might, be religious as you want. You cannot get to heaven. You're foul. You're in your sin. You're dead to God. There's a depravity. You are corrupt. You are cast off from God. We say that. We do say that. That is the natural state of everyone. But we say, see, but that doesn't have to be the last chapter. There's no hope in yourself, but you can be saved. The cross is gloomy, but there's a resurrection. Goliath's a giant, but he will die. Your chapter of despair that you're living right now, I don't know what it is. You may think there is no solution to it. Good. That's exactly where you need to be. If you can look down and see that your life is a stage set for the glory of God, and if you can look up and see the giant formidable standing in front of you, if you can by faith look up past his head to the God who tells you, I am with you, I will deliver you, then you will see him deliver you at the 11th hour. I don't know how, but you will hear the thwack and you will hear the thud. Let's pray.